Our guest today is John Wilbanks, who is the Chief Commons Officer at Sage Bionetworks. Thank you very much, John, for taking our call to speak with the UN Brief. We are delighted to have you today in the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We have discussed the issues of data sharing between international organizations and also the private sector during the Road to Bern event last week here in Geneva, organized by the Swiss Office of Federal Affairs. I would like to see with you, what were the main takeaways from these discussions?
For me, I think that the biggest was really being pleased with the commitment of the international community to continue moving on data sharing. I think that's the most important piece for me, is seeing this kind of multinational, multilateral, multi-stakeholder movement in this direction is the sort of thing that those of us who've been working in open data for 20 years, we've been waiting to see this, and it's wonderful. So that's my top takeaway. I think the other is that it's complicated. It's, data is not sort of the same as a cultural work. It's in many ways much more contextual. We're not primed to process it the way we process photographs or text or movies, which is, I think, a little more collective in some ways. Data, we have to have so much annotation on data to make it useful. There's so many different kinds of data that it's really hard to talk about it as one thing. And so we need to talk differently about government data that needs to be in the public domain so that we can build public services on it. Then we talk about biology data that is happening in a small laboratory, and in turn differently than we talk about physics data that's happening, at CERN. And so that scale, and that's just Switzerland, right? And so the context and the scale and the nationality of this means that it's going to be hard to have one solution. And so that was my other sort of takeaway, is it's going to be complicated, and we have to be taking more of an ecosystem approach than an either or approach to open or closed.
And tell me a bit about the Consent to Research project. What does that entail, and what kind of actions have sprung from that gathering?
So the Consent to Research project was an idea that in much the same way that we use open software licenses or open cultural licenses to let creators share their works publicly, that we might create something akin to that using informed consent for people to donate their data to biomedical research. And we found that it was actually quite difficult legally because we construct the regulations for every study individually. And so it's very hard to have a unitary consent to a multitude of research studies. But the big takeaway was realizing how badly the informed part of informed consent works, both in consumer culture, but even in biomedicine. Only 2 out of 5 people can answer very simple questions about what they've just read in informed consent. And so what we really brought out of it was a belief in applying human-centered design to legal documents so that people understood what they were getting into, and really working on that informed part of informed consent. And then trying to move that into the mainstream through partnerships with Apple's Research Kit system, through large national projects in the United States, like the All of Us Research Program, with the goal of using open informed consent, not to sort of give me the right to donate my data all over the world, but to give these larger systemic studies that can represent the population fairly, that can be inclusive and oversample underrepresented populations to correct for decades of bias. That's really where the consent approach was most powerful. Although there are others who continue to work on the donate your data process, including Ernst Hoffen in Switzerland. And so I think that concept moves on. My own, I was just really struck after I got into it about how badly people understood the deal and how unfair it was that people didn't understand or informed consent. And so that kind of took me off on a different path.
And what else do you see happening now? Because we are living into this incredible crisis, and of course the issues of privacy issues and data gathering what are the challenges now? Really, it's sort of accelerated everything that was already on the table for discussion, sort of reviewing principles, frameworks to work together in for international cooperation, both in science and in other areas. What you see where what is the main issues and challenges right now with COVID-19?
I mean, I think you said it right. The key word is accelerated, because that's what it feels like. It feels like it's tempting to sit here and say, "Oh, everything's changed. We're all going to be open," but that's not what it looks like from where I sit. It looks like, as you said, things are accelerated, and so there has been discussion of using mobile devices for public health surveillance. That's accelerated. And unfortunately, it's accelerated out of a regulated research study where we have informed consent and bioethics principles are sort of relatively well established, and into this public health emergency role in the United States, at least, where there's a lot less rules on data gathering, sharing, movement, and so forth. And so on the good side, there's a lot of, again, and I can only really speak to the US experience. I'm very sort of bend here, especially once the pandemic hit, we're all very sort of, stuck. But the US experience has been large national data integration projects under relatively strict cybersecurity and bioethical and regulatory requirements. At the same time, you see a lot of these, we have state level applications that are trying to do contact tracing. Some of them using the Bluetooth Google Apple system. And we already have the police in the United States saying we're going to contact trace protesters. And now they don't mean it the same way, but I think that it gets at the potential for, there's all these reasons to not do things ethically. It's fundamentally, it's faster and easier to not be ethical. That's why lots of people who aren't required by regulations to be ethical are unethical in lots of companies. But we have these guardrails in place, these systems in place during normal times that require you to at least think about these things. And so my fear is that this acceleration is maintained after it needs to be maintained. If it that we don't even have time to discuss if it needs to be accelerated in the first place, and that it sticks around. Again, in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. The data sharing and citizen surveillance was instantiated as a kind of an emergency measure. We still have that legislation today, 19 years later. And so that's the thing I sort of worry about, is that. But I do have hope. The national row-level data sharing of electronic health record data for COVID in the United States, which is a project called the N3C, the National COVID Cohort Collaborative. That's happening. That's a multi-institution, fully negotiated, well-governed. The data are all going to live in a very secure, certified environment. And you look at that and you say, well, if that's actually a good story in the middle of, because there's all this other scary stuff, but there's also this evidence that you can do complicated private data sharing in a way that sort of accelerates the innovation, but also protects the people whose data is in there. And so, the next step is making sure that the terms for that are clear. Like, when do they have to delete the data? And if it's Palantir is the technology vendor, which a lot of people critique, and I've critiqued them elsewhere. What rights do they have at the end of this? Do they have rights to anything that happens that they learn in their statistical model? I think that's the next step, is making sure that the vendors in these things, because we want secure vendors, but those vendors don't get unfair advantage going forward. But it's a process. It's a complicated system. But going back to you started this for me with the word accelerated, because that's what it feels like. Every day I wake up and it's just.
So what are the next steps in terms of following up with the discussions we had during the Road to Bern event?
Well, I know they released the report this morning. I haven't had time to read it yet today, and so I'll dig through that. I think we're starting to see some international level of agreement and coordination, minus my country, because we don't participate internationally very well right now, but around the importance of open data at the government level. how important that is to transparency, and to innovation. When you look at, something as simple as roads and maps really drive a lot of services that are useful to the individual. Clearly we're going to see something around COVID internationally. What it looks like, we don't know. Certainly out of the 2009 viral crises, swine flu, that we got the GIS AID data sharing database for infectious diseases that's driving COVID response. I'd imagine we'll see something similar to that, but that is not about the genetics of the virus. That's about the experience of the people and reaction to the virus. And hopefully, if there's some change in some of our countries, including mine, that in the next 4 to 5 years, that we'll have some international harmonization on things like data protection and minimum standards of privacy. And, clearly we need to reckon with digital technologies, privacy and data protection, and we haven't done that internationally yet. And so my hope is that this is one of those big steps on the road to that conversation.
Thank you very much. John Wilbanks, Chief Commons Officer at Sage Bionetworks. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And I hope at bientôt.
A bientôt.
Thank you. Bye-bye.